Good day, my name is Bolt and today we'll speak about Aristotle's conception of tragic catharsis. Catharsis has three meanings. It could mean purgation, purification, or clarification, and critics have interpreted Aristotle's views in the light of each of these meanings, and it has not done much to ease the difficulty because only one thing has been agreed upon, that the tragedy should arouse pity and fear. But there is difference of opinion as to how the arousal of these emotions lead to tragic pleasure. The term catharsis occurs in Aristotle's definition of tragedy. He writes, "Tragedy is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, and in the form of action, not of a narrative, through pity and fear affecting the proper catharsis or purgation of these emotions." We see that the term is also linked with the concept of pity and fear. It is therefore necessary to consider the meanings of pity and fear as connected with tragedy. Pity, we are told by Aristotle, is occasioned by undeserved misfortune, and fear by that of one like ourselves. In the rhetoric, fear is defined as a kind of pain or disturbance due to a mental picture of some destructive or painful evil in the future. Having dealt with the emotions of pity and fear, let us now go on the concept of the catharsis of such emotions. Various interpretations have been offered regarding this term. The first one is catharsis taken as a medical term. Purgation theories. The term catharsis has been interpreted in medical terms, meaning purgation. In medical terms, especially in the older sense, purgation meant the partial removal of excess humors. The health of the body depended on the true balance of the humors. This purgation of these emotions of pity and fear does not mean the removal of these emotions, but that the passions or emotions are reduced to a healthy, balanced proportion. Catharsis in this sense denotes a pathological effect on the soul comparable to the effect of medicine on the body. The passage in the Politics, which gives strong justification to the view that catharsis is a relief to overcharged feeling. Those who are subject to the emotions of pity and fear and the feelings generally will necessarily be affected in the same way, and so will other men in exact proportion to their susceptibility to such emotions. Aristotle himself tells us that tragedy has its own kind of pleasure and that we must seek it from this pleasure, the pleasure proper to it. And catharsis involves such a pleasure. The function of tragedy is to provide the pleasure peculiar to it. This pleasure involves the presentation of events which arouse pity and fear, and according to this theory, catharsis becomes an indication of the function of tragedy and not of its emotional effects on the audience. Catharsis is related to incidents of the tragedy, not to the emotions of pity and fear evoked in the audience. The purification theory of catharsis. One meaning of catharsis is purification. Some critics have interpreted the term in the light of this meaning. These critics reject the interpretation of catharsis in the light of medical terminology. Humphrey House, for instance, says that Aristotle's concept of catharsis was not as a medical term. He interprets the word to mean a kind of moral condition in which the spectator undergoes. He comments that purgation means cleansing. This cleansing may be a quantitative evacuation or a qualitative change in the body, the restoration of the proper equilibrium. In the context, he says, a tragedy arouses pity and fear from potentiality to activity through worthy and adequate stimuli to control them by directing them to the right objects in the right way, and exercises them within the limits of the play, as the emotions of the good man would be exercised. When they subside to potentially again after the play is over, it is a more trained potentially than before. Our responses are brought nearer to those of the good and wise man. Catharsis results in emotional health. Catharsis is thus a moral conditioning. It is purification of the excess and defect in our emotions so that emotional equilibrium can be restored. According to House, Aristotle's whole doctrine only makes sense if you realize that the proper development and balance of the emotions depend upon the habitual direction of them towards worthy objects. The clarification theory of catharsis. There are some critics who show that the implication of catharsis are to be found in the poetics itself without any need to refer to the politics or the ethics. Writing on the imitative arts, Aristotle points out that the pleasure in the imitative arts is connected with learning. Pleasure does not come from joy alone. Even the picture of dead bodies can give pleasure if well executed. This shows that pleasure is linked with learning, that pleasure is there is anything fitted to instruct. It is paradox that even the ugly and the repellent can go and do give pleasure. A similar paradox lies there in tragedy. The tragic incidents are painful. They might present horrible situations of a man blinding himself, or a woman killing her husband, or a mother killing her child. Such events would horrify us and repel us in real life, but yet in tragedy they afford us a special pleasure. It is a pleasure peculiar to tragedy. Aristotle himself tells us that tragedy has its own kind of pleasure, and that we must seek it from the pleasure proper to it. And catharsis involves such a pleasure. The function of tragedy is to provide the pleasure peculiar to it, and this pleasure involves the presentation of events which arouse pity and fear. And according to this theory, catharsis becomes an indication of the function of tragedy, and not of its emotional effects on the audience. Catharsis is related to incidents of the tragedy, not to the emotions of pity and fear evoked in the audience. Catharsis involves a process of learning. Tragic pleasure arises from the fact that imitation produces that sort of pleasure which comes from learning. This learning comes from our discovery of a certain relationship between the particular events presented in the imitation and certain universal elements embodied in it. And has already been remarked, the poet selects and orders his material according to the laws of probability and necessity. He presents what might be more than what is. This is what makes a poet more philosophical than a historian, for he makes the particular into the general. He deals with the universal, and the events are presented as freetal accidentals, transients, and chances which might obscure their true significance. Tragedy brings a better understanding, and it brings the spectator face to face without the universal law. The tragic poet selects incidents embodying pity and fear, and then presents them in such a way as to bring out the probable or necessary principles that unite them in a single action and determine their relation to this action as it proceeds from its beginning to its end. When the spectator has witnessed a tragedy of this type, he will have learned something. The incidents will be clarified in the sense that their relation, in terms of universal, will have become manifest in the act of learning, says Aristotle, and it will be enjoyable. In the light of this theory, catharsis refers to the incidents of the tragedy rather than to the psychology of the audience. Catharsis is not purgation of emotions, nor it is a purification of emotions. It refers to the way in which the poet has presented his incidents of pity and fear to rise from the particular to the universal. Catharsis is not the catharsis of the audience, but of pity and fear themselves. Indeed, Aristotle does not refer to the audience in the definition of tragedy. It becomes inevitable that he is talking of the work of tragedy itself. He is talking of the suitable embodiment of pity and fear. In this sense, catharsis means simply the ideal state, but with reference to the tragedy, and not with reference to the emotional state of the audience. Pity and fear take on the ideal form in course of the composition of tragedy. Of tragedy, Aristotle says, we must not demand of tragedy any and every kind of pleasure, but only that which is proper to it. And since the pleasure which the poet should afford is that which comes from pity and fear through imitation, it is evident that this quality must be impressed upon the incidents. Thus the pleasure peculiar to tragedy comes from pity and fear. That's all for now. Subscribe. See you later. Good night.